Hello and welcome from Troy, Idaho. So glad to have you joining us online. And today we're going to get right into part 2 of a series that we're doing called The Power Paradox. You want to be great? Give up your power to people who don't have any. Do you want to be great? Become like a servant. Become like a child. Become like a slave. Throughout Jesus' ministry, this was a repeated theme. He said again and again, and not only did he give this teaching to his disciples, he demonstrated it in his life. Although he was God, he gave up his privilege so that we could have the privilege of being with him. You want to be great? Give up your privilege to people who don't have any. The power paradox. We see this throughout the entire Bible, and I want to look at a few examples. This first one comes from Matthew 23, 8 through 12. Jesus says, "But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." This is the upside-down kingdom paradox that Jesus teaches again and again throughout his ministry. The way that we see things in our Western worldview of go, 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 get, is we climb the ladder. We start at the bottom, and we climb the ladder until we get the success of money and fame and all the privileges that come with that. That takes hard work, and sometimes it takes stepping on people to advance. But Jesus is saying his kingdom is the exact opposite. Instead of climbing the ladder to success, you are to go the opposite way. Go against the grain. If you want to be great, you become small. If you want to be first, you become last. Again and again, Jesus repeats this basic message. So for example, in Matthew chapter 18, he literally pulls a child from the crowd, and he brings this child as an object lesson, places this child in the midst of the disciples, and he says this. At the time, the disciples were saying to Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Become like a child. Become like a servant. And then as we see in this passage from Matthew 20, 25 through 27, become like a slave. It's interesting because this passage is repeated in all of the synoptic gospels. In one version, it's the mother of James and John. In another version, it's James and John coming to Jesus, and they all want to know, how do we become great? So Jesus responds, and he says this. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So now this idea that Jesus expressed again and again and again, did his disciples get it? The people that wrote the New Testament, including the Apostle Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament, did he get this message? The answer is clearly yes. In fact, as you read Paul, 54 times in his epistles, he refers to Jesus as Kurios, that is Lord. Basically, he's saying, I know who the ruler is. His name is Jesus. His name is Lord. And then reflecting on that passage of not lording authority over others, Paul tracks with a direct inference in 1 Corinthians 9:19, and he says this, "For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. Paul is a disciple. He's learned the lesson from his master, and he gets it completely. He tracks with it. He totally understands what he's saying here. And in fact, there's one book, and it's the book of Philemon, and I think he writes this whole book so that we can more clearly understand this power dynamic. First of all, there's this slave who has ran away from his master, and Paul tells him, you know what? As a Christian, it would be good if you dignified this relationship by returning. And this is a hard call for Onesimus because he found freedom, but Paul is encouraging him to go back. But he dignifies that call through the relationship of the Lord. But it doesn't just end there. He doesn't just talk to the lowest of the low, the slave in this relationship. The letter is directly to the slave owner, and Paul ends this whole letter by saying this: for perhaps he was for this reason separated from you for a while, that you would have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Paul is telling him here, as a Christian, it is your duty not to look at somebody as a slave, but as a brother. And if you can't do this, basically you are not a legitimate Christian. He dignifies the slave and he dignifies the slave owner, but he gives a hard call to both. You have to climb down the ladder. You have to give up your privilege. You have to give up your rights. And in doing that, you find that you are actually walking in the more excellent and Christian way. Now, take a look at this next picture, if I can get my screen to click on it again. And there's this quote, you're familiar with this person, Mahatma Gandhi, and he says, "The day the power of love overrules the love of power, the world will know peace." How often does this happen? Not very often, right? Because most of the time, it seems that the world loves power at the expense of peace. But there are moments, there are times when individuals go against the grain, and we see that this way that Jesus suggested may actually be possible. So take a look at this picture and ask yourself, what would you do if you were imprisoned for your political beliefs and activism? How would you respond if you had to serve the first 18 of your 27 years in this small prison cell, confined to this small cell without a bed or plumbing? You could write and receive a letter once every 6 months, and you were allowed to meet with a person in person once a year for only 30 minutes. How would you cope? This was the reality for Nelson Mandela when he was released from jail and later became president of South Africa. He was pressured to get revenge on his enemies that had done so much harm. So, on his inauguration day, May 10, 1994, he says that he was tempted to hate. He was tempted to hate as he was released from prison and he saw those guards that had mistreated him. But he did something different. Mandela invited his jailer to his inauguration and brought white opposition parties into his own government. Years later, President Bill Clinton visited with Mandela in the cell that Mandela served that long sentence at. And Mr. Clinton asked Mandela, "Tell me the truth. When you were walking down the road the last time, didn't you hate them?" Mandela answered, I did. I'm old enough to tell the truth. I felt hatred and fear, but I said to myself, if you hate them when you get into that car, you will still be their prisoner. And I wanted to be free, and so I let it go. On August 6, 1990, he led a chaotic, fractious African National Congress executive meeting which decided to suspend the army struggle against the apartheid government. For many ANC cadres, this was the ultimate betrayal In their view, taking away the threat of violence meant the ANC had lost all power against the apartheid state. But Mandela sent all ANC leaders across the country to convince the militants otherwise, and his view prevailed. Numerous other moments, such as this one, were to come. In all of them, despite the criticisms, Mandela chose peace over war, reconciliation over vengeance, and humanity over barbarity. When the ANC's most popular and militant leader, Chris Hani, was murdered by a right-winger in 1993, it was Mandela who told the angry youth to aim for peace, not war. When bombs went off on the eve of the 1994 elections and hundreds were murdered by security police in the township violence, Mandela called for calm, not war. And he was vindicated. The 1994 election ushered in a fragile democracy, and after that, Mandela was emboldened to pursue his program of peace and reconciliation. What followed silenced even his harshest critics, and depicted in the movie Invictus, he inspired the nation by embracing rugby, a sport considered to be that of the oppressor, and turning South Africa's 1995 Rugby World Cup into a moment of reconciliation. Love is greater than power, and Mandela demonstrated this. Mandela used his power to unite. He was not vindictive. He used his authority to empower South Africa. He chose freedom from his own demons. And in doing so, he chose to take his own people along with him and make them set aside their own demons too. He made a warring, hate-filled South Africa choose peace and reconciliation above that which was expected. He used his authority by laying it down. See the significance of this? People in his government were calling for blood, for a vindictive revenge, and he had the authority to do it. But instead of using his authority, he laid it down, and he chose a better way. So let's do a quick recap. The New Testament is full of this. Jesus is basically affirming that the path that Mandela chose is the path that every Christian is to choose. You want to be great? Become small. Don't lord your power over other people. Become like a slave. Become like a child. Become like a servant. So with all that in mind, why is it that we come across a text in the New Testament that says something like this? This is one of the most, I think, misunderstood passages in Scripture. And it's almost jarring when you see everything that we just saw with Jesus, and you see that Paul understands this. But in this letter to Timothy, he says something like this. Let me read it together with you now. Paul says, 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. And remember, we already saw that Paul understood what Jesus was saying when he says, do not lord it over others. Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 9:19 that he would become like a slave. He uses the term Lord over 54 times in his epistles. He writes this letter in Philemon, which is all about giving up power. And in Romans 16, he lists 10 women, and he empowers all of these women. So what is going on in this passage in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, where he says, I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man? What does that mean? And how does this all make sense? So a couple principles as we get started. And I think this is going to become a whole lot more clear by the end, and I think in empowering ways. But first principle. Number one, it has to be read in light of the other texts that are more clear, more broad, and more general. We went over that principle last week as we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and the same thing applies here. So what we've seen already is we look at Jesus' words. What does Jesus say? What does he command? And then we look at what does Paul say in other places? What does Peter say in other places? And it's clear, the repeated theme again and again is no person, no gender, no religious group is to dominate and use their authority to put someone else down. Okay, so that's hopefully clear. But then the second thing that we can do is we can look at the language and translation and ask, is this accurate? And then finally, and this is really important as well, we can look at the immediate context. So we look at Timothy. Why is Paul writing to Timothy in the first place? What is Paul's concern? What is Paul trying to do? Why is Timothy even in Ephesus? What are the false teachings that are talked about in this book? All of those things help us understand a passage that seems to contradict the rest of the New Testament. And one more quick thing that I'll say too. When we see Paul writing to Timothy, he's writing to a person and not to a church. And so this is more akin to, like if I was emailing one of you that are watching this right now, and let's call this person Sandy. So I'm emailing Sandy, and you see Pastor Kevin's email to Sandy. That's one side of a correspondence, but you don't see Sandy's response back to me. We don't have anything that Timothy responds back to Paul. And we don't know if Paul wrote more things to Timothy, but it's a direct correspondence of which we only have one side and to a person, not to a church. And I say all of that to say the larger general teachings you would want to find like in places like in Romans, where he makes it more of a theology-based as opposed to a specific time and circumstance to an individual that he does here in writing to Timothy. But what I want to start off today with is the part 2, where we're going to look at the language and translation. And this is paramount when it comes to understanding 1 Timothy 2, verse 12. So, the first thing that we see when it uses that term authority, that term is a hapax logomena. That means that it is the only occurrence of this particular word in all of the Bible. It only occurs once. And other times that Paul talks about authority, and he does this hundreds of times, he always uses the word exousia, which means power, and he never uses this word anywhere else, this word for authority, authentine. So, that means that we need to be very careful as we look at this particular word, because Paul could have used this word, exousia, that he uses everywhere else, but in this circumstance, in this place, he uses the word authentine, and it's the only time it occurs in the Bible. So that's interesting. That should make us pause. What does this mean? And even though this word never occurs anywhere else in the Bible, we can look at other occurrences outside of the Bible where people use this and look at the context when it's used. And there are over 300 times that it has been used that scholars can examine. So let's take a look at one of them now. This is one of the times that this word authentine is used. This is used by Basinos at the Council of Chalcedon, and here's what he says. I was appointed as a bishop by violence. The canons are clearly the authority. The fathers would say, if there is a preferred procedure, it is for holding an election for office and not to resign. I urge you to listen to me. When this reckless deed was done, they used force. That's the word, authentine. They used force and broke into my room and grabbed me. And then we looked to join the priesthood, but they looked for violence. So in this example, is this the kind of authority that you would want, say, me as a pastor to be using on the congregation? Now, is this the kind of pastor that you'd want? Because as you can examine these 300 times the word is used, it's never used in a benevolent way. That is to say, this authority is never used in a way that anybody would ever want to be treated. No exceptions. And here's some of the examples. This word authentine could describe a doer of a massacre, the author of crimes, perpetrator of sacrilege, supporter of violent actions, murderer of oneself, perpetrator of slaughter, murderer, slayer, slayer of oneself, authority, perpetrator of evil, one who murders by his own hand. Is that your kind of pastor? You want to go to this church? Is this the kind of authority that you would want somebody to have? Now, this is important because this passage has been used to discriminate against women to make it so that they can't be pastors. Men have authority, it is said. They have the ability to do this, but women don't. But as we're going to see, Paul is not advocating for either gender to have this kind of authority. So let's go a little bit further. What kind of authority is this? You know, you can read in the Quran, and there's a similar sounding passage if we read it through Western ears, and it says this: men have authority over women because God has made the one superior to the other, and because they spend their wealth to maintain them, good women are obedient. They guard their unseen parts because God has guarded them. As for those from whom you fear disobedience, admonish them and forsake them in beds apart and beat them. And Timothy 2, read through Western ears a lot of times, it says, again, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over man. She must be quiet. And what that has been translated as in Western cultures is, woman, shut up, be quiet. You can't preach at the pulpit. You can't be a pastor. You got to be lower than the man. But we've just seen that this word authority is a word that God, Paul, any disciple in the New Testament would not want anybody to be advocating for. Cynthia Westfall, and I quoted her book last week in her book Paul and Gender, says this: many outside of the debate assume that authenteo is a technical term for being a pastor, since it is the primary justification for excluding women from the office of pastor and from other leadership over men. However, out of the over 300 occurrences of the verb, no one has identified a case where it refers to any kind of benevolent pastoral care of an individual or a group by a pastor or a church official. Cynthia Westfall is basically saying, don't use this text to say what a pastor can and cannot do, because nobody should be doing this. So, that's a little bit of the linguistic background. And again, we can see why this is so important. Now, if you're not a Greek scholar, and I'm not, you can do what I do. And you can go free online to Bible Hub and look up that word yourself. Look up the parallel passages, and you can see that this is the only time that it occurs. But the next thing that we can do, and also super important, is to understand the context. Why is Paul specifically addressing the authority of women in Ephesus? Like, wouldn't it be simple if this is what the word means? Why not just say, nobody should have authority, this authentine, over anybody else? Well, because Paul is addressing a specific context. What is the context? What was happening in Ephesus? What were the false teachings that were going around? And do this study on your own, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight a few things here. A few of the false teachings, and there were many more, but for the purpose of today, right there in 1 Timothy 1:4, we see that there was myths and genealogies. There was old wives' tales. And also in Ephesus, you are going to be familiar if you've read through the Bible. In Acts chapter 19, there's this fascinating story of something taking place in Ephesus, and it is the Artemis cult. This is all taking place in this huge port city, and understanding this helps give a lot of context to why Paul may specifically be addressing women in this scenario. So, let's dig into it. What is Artemis? Who is Artemis? And what might this have to do with what Paul was saying to Timothy and why he needed to go to Ephesus? Historians Ferguson and Farnell write that the Artemis priesthood hierarchy was dominated by women. Men could become priests, but only if they first renounced their masculinity through the act of ritual castration. In addition to being castrated, they also abstained from certain types of food. Then, in the 1st century, we see a quote from Diodorus, and he says, "Beside the river of Thermodon, therefore a nation ruled by females had sway. in which women pursued the arts of war just like men. To the men, she, the nation's queen, relegated the spinning of wool and other household tasks of women. She promulgated laws whereby she led forth the woman to marital strife, while on the men she fastened humiliation and servitude. Also, Pompeius, 1st century BC, says, they also dismissed all thought of intermarriage with their neighbors, calling it slavery rather than marriage. They embarked instead upon an enterprise unparalleled in the whole of history, that of building up a state without men and then actually defending it themselves. Then, with peace assured by the military success, they entered into sexual relationships with surrounding peoples so that their line would not die out. After conquering most of Europe, they also seized a number of city-states in Asia. Here, they founded Ephesus. So, super fascinating background, right? And as you read, and you're going to have to do this on your own time for the sake of our time today, as you read, I think it's very probable that what is happening in Ephesus is a sort of syncretism, as there is these new Christian believers that are products of their environment, of this history, and of the Artemis cult. They're combining religious and also this cultish worship, and this is false doctrine. And there are some people that are not wanting to get married, not wanting to have children, and because Artemis is the god of fertility and all the wisdom that goes with this, they are taking these things and starting to apply it in ways that's damaging to marriage and to relationships. And not only that, when they are gaining power, they are in some ways using it to put men down. And Paul is addressing this because nobody should have this sort of power over anybody else. So, would Paul permit men to have this kind of authority, but not women? And again, look at these words. I won't read them all, but this authentine means doer of massacre, author of crimes, perpetrators of sacrilege, and on and on and on. And I would say his basic point is nobody should do this, but he's addressing what is going wrong in Ephesus. And so he tells Timothy to go to Ephesus and address this particular scenario where in this case there's women that are trying to dominate, to put down, to do violence to men. It doesn't happen all that often, but in Ephesus, and we see some of the history, that could have been going on. So Cynthia Westfall, again kind of wrapping this up, she says, since 1 Timothy 2:12 is the primary source used to exclude women from various forms of leadership in the church, the decision or selection of a meaning for authenteo is crucial for understanding the nature of the prohibition. It should be the work of the church to flesh out an understanding of this word based on sound lexicography and linguistic methodology in order to proceed in the discussion with caution. The church has reached its age of accountability. It is time to assume responsibility or liability for excluding women from church leadership positions based on the word authenteo. Now, I can tell you, I went to seminary with women who are smarter than me. I've heard the stories of ladies who have been called to pastoral ministry. And pastoral ministry, let's just be clear. Pastoral ministry does not mean this sort of authentine. Pastoral ministry is what Jesus said. It means using your power, using your privilege to lift other people up. Let's quote it again. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." You know, this is something that Nelson Mandela was able to put into practice. People in authority used their power to put him down as a political rival. 27 years, 18 of which he served in this small cell. He suffered and he lost his freedom. Now, he could have been plotting that whole time, when I get out, I'm going to make those guys pay. And he even says he's not a saint, and he had many bad thoughts at times about his prison guards and the abusers. But thankfully, he chose a better way. Nelson Mandela said, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." Mandela used his authority to bring peace. He gave his power up, the power for vindication, so that his country could have reconciliation. And if you've never seen the movie Invictus that tells of the rugby South African team and Mandela coming together, it's a powerful movie that shows exactly what this looks like in principle. The principle of the Bible that's repeated again and again and again is, if you want to be great, you become small. You use your authority not to lord it over other people, but to lift them up. True authority is submitting your authority to the authority of God. So this has been Power Paradox Part 2, and I think I'll do one more in this series that looks at this upside down sort of kingdom that's so misunderstood in the Western culture today, because we just go, we climb. But Jesus says it's the exact opposite. If you want to be great, you become small. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. And as we've hopefully seen from today in this passage in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, that authority that tries to domineer, to lord over, to do violence, is the exact opposite of what Jesus' kingdom is all about. And I want to invite you, if you are interested and free this week, we're going through a Bible study, and it's on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. We'll have the Zoom link on our Facebook and in our church email. And we're going through Philippians. We'll be in Philippians chapter 2. And this is a place where Paul, again, just makes it so clear. He says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he was God, he humbled himself to the point of death on a cross." That's the point. That's what we are called to follow, to take up our own cross, not to use our power and privilege to put over people, but to lay it down and to lift people up. Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, I want to pray for any person who's ever been hurt by the power structure of a church gone wrong. For any person who has ever been trampled on, abused, and beaten. That is opposite of the way of your kingdom. The paradox is that if we want to be great, we give up our power. And I want to pray for people that have privilege of whatever kind, that you can convict them, encourage them to think of ways that they can use this authority and this privilege to help bring peace and reconciliation. Help us to understand the power paradox of your kingdom. And I pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen. Grace and peace, everyone, and look forward to concluding this series next week with you in Power Paradox Part 3.